All right, so as we move into our rough drafts, I want to break down the paragraph structure and what might show up and in which order. And a lot of this is not new information, as we've talked about intro paragraphs and body paragraphs and conclusion paragraphs. But throughout the year, we've done a lot of lit analysis. And you're still integrating evidence, but that evidence was mostly coming from the literature we were reading. Now we're really focusing on sort of that nonfiction scholarly evidence and integrating it in to prove a very specific argument. So it's set up similarly, but the focus is slightly different. So as we start with intro paragraphs, we're looking at the same triangle where we go from very broad information like a hook, start narrowing our information into background info, historical context, definition, and ending with the most specific part of this paragraph, which is our thesis statement, which provides the argument and roadmap for our paper. You should already have a thesis statement that is set up. You should have received feedback from me if you turned it in, and hopefully your argument is all set as we move into this process. I introduce the intro paragraph first just because I think chronologically and I like to start here. You are not obligated to start writing your intro paragraph first. Some people find it really difficult to start at this point and like to jump into the body of their paper. That's fine. I'm still going to present this first. As you have a thesis statement, you could start with the body. But as we talk about research papers, it's important to sort of understand the rhetorical appeals. And we've talked about these maybe slightly throughout the year, but haven't broken them down specifically. You should have heard of them, 9th and 10th grade, especially if you had Cubic. He talks about these a lot. So the three appeals we're going to talk about are ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is credibility. So ethos is the appeal focused on the writer, so you. It refers to the character of the writer, including his or her credibility and trustworthiness. So you are actually trying to build your own credibility within the paper. So the reader must be convinced that the author is an authority and merits attention. This is done two ways: through the use of academic language and the integration of scholarly research. The second one is pathos. So this is the emotional appeal. You're going to have a lot less pathos in a research paper, but it's important to talk about it, especially when considering how to make your intro. So pathos is the rhetorical appeal that focuses on the reader. Pathos refers to the emotions that are stirred in the reader while reading the essay. And the author should seek to trigger specific emotional reactions in their writing. And then finally, logos, which is logic. Logos is the rhetorical appeal that focuses on the argument being presented by the author. It is an appeal to rationality, referring to the clarity and logical integrity of that argument, so your thesis. And this appeal is often presented through the use of evidence, facts, and statistics. So logos is set up by your thesis statement, your argument, and proven by the scholarly research, facts, statistics that you weave into your paper. And this logos builds your ethos, your credibility. So within your introduction, there are three pieces, as we know. You start with the hook. The hook is literally just a general, broad statement that begins to hint at what your topic is going to be. Don't overthink this. Please don't start with a random definition that has nothing to do with your paper, or a random quote from Benjamin Franklin because we all know who he is, or a rhetorical question where you ask me, have you ever wondered? No, I haven't. I've read this topic many times. Instead, you're just looking to start to hint at what your topic is going to be. So you may want to think about beginning with a rhetorical appeal. Most likely pathos or logos. So do you want to hook the reader with an emotional trigger, and I'll show you an example, or hook them with an impressive or startling statistic? And this kind of depends on your topic, and I'll show you two examples, one that uses pathos or emotion and one that uses logos or logic. Once you set that up and you're now broadly hinting at your topic through emotion or through facts and logic, you're then going to present your background information or historical context or definitions. It depends on your topic. So this is the section of your intro where you present the reader with the most basic and concise information they need to know to begin to understand your topic. If your topic needs a significant amount of background information or historical context, then you're going to want to consider expanding that information into your first body paragraph before you ever begin your argument. So you actually have a couple options here. Your intro for a research paper is generally a little bit longer than typical. It probably will be 3/4 of a page because you have to set up some background information. If you are noticing that your topic is really complex and you need to set up quite a bit of background information or quite a bit of historical context, be concise within your intro, and then your first body paragraph actually fully explains that background information before you get into discussing your thesis. Which leads us to the last part of your introduction, which is your thesis statement. So you're going to end your intro with that 1 to 2 sentence thesis statement that presents the argument and the direction of your paper. So this should have set up the roadmap, the organization of your paper. So that's kind of the setup of the intro. I want to give you 2 examples of introductory paragraphs I've received in the past, and I'll attach these 2 documents. So both of these topics are about prison in some way. This first one's going to be specifically about capital punishment and the death penalty, and she's going to hook you with pathos, so emotion. The second introduction is actually going to be about the flaws in the prison system, and she's going to base her argument more on logos and facts. So kind of 2 ways to think about this. And you'll notice they are larger. Research paper introductions tend to be. So this one's going to use pathos to introduce the paper. The title is The Unusual Cruelty of Capital Punishment. And she's going to start us out with a really specific story about a 16-year-old. And I'll just kind of go through this. So in the year 1980, a white 16-year-old female in the state of Texas had disappeared for several days. Clarence Bradley, an African-American janitor that worked at the school the female attended, and his white coworker both had found her body within the school. When interrogated by the police said to the men, "One of you 2 is going to hang for this. Since you're the N-word, you're elected." The biased police officer rushed to the conclusion that Bradley was the cause of her death, leading Bradley to go straight to prison on death row. However, 10 years later, an organization that specialized in wrongly convicted inmates took on Bradley's case. Numerous court appeals subsequent, Clarence Bradley was proven his innocence and was released after spending a decade in prison for the crime he did not commit. This example is only one out of many that show the fault within the justice system. Without the help of Centurion Ministries, the volunteer group that liberated Bradley, this man would have been killed for the crime he was wrongly accused of. Nonetheless, this issue is more specifically pointed to the punishment Clarence would have received, capital punishment. For many years, there have been considerable controversial opinions upon whether the death penalty equally justifies a life sentence without parole. However, not until recently a new question was put into thought, consequent as to if the death penalty is an estranged punishment that is associated with a degree of cruelty. Capital punishment, another name for the death penalty, has loosely been established within the United States as early as 1608. Yet in 1973, the United States Supreme Court justified that the continuing process of the death penalty violated the 8th and 14th Amendments. The court case was later overturned in the year 1977, declaring that the punishment of death no longer violates the Constitution. This law was further reacted due to the creation of new rational implements. Appealingly, since the end of the abolition movement of capital punishment, as of 1976, there has been 1,448 inmates executed. In accord with the inhumane process of the death penalty and the various methods of execution, capital punishment violates the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. So this introduction starts with Pathos, gives you a personal story of a man that was wrongly convicted, put on death row, and only because of a volunteer service was he granted justice. It then transitions to some logos, some information about the Supreme Court cases and the amendments that she is then going to argue the death penalty goes against. And we end with her thesis, her argument that essentially the death penalty is inhumane and it goes against cruel and unusual punishment. So that's one way to set up an intro. The other way is to focus completely on logos, facts, and statistics. So this introduction is going to be about the American prison system. It's going to talk about the large numbers of incarcerated adults. It's going to give historical context to prison system, all the way back to the 1700s, and then come back to America today. So a slightly different take on this. This is incapable imprisonment for hypocrisy. According to the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics, 2,266,800 adults were incarcerated in U.S. federal and state prisons and county jails at year-end 2011. This shocking statistic, when this country was founded on liberty and justice for all. But does this exclude the number of mentally ill and addicted prisoners wasting their life away restricted to a cell? To fully understand the urgency and volatility of this dated system, the origins must be fully comprehended. The idea and execution of incarceration is nothing new. The system dates all the way back to 1750 BC. The Romans were among the first to use prisons as a form of punishment rather than simply for detention. For America, the history of prisons and incarceration has existed since the 1700s. Prisons then were only used as holding cells until further punishment was decided. Within the 18th century, Quakers were the first to consider imprisonment as opposed to the use of capital punishment. This idea was the mold for America's current justice system. During this early stage, it was thought that solitary confinement or labor would transform all the prisoners' behavior. With advancements in psychology, the data presents that the prison system has evolved for the worst, even though laws and regulations have changed drastically. The core belief of incarceration has not shifted, even though the advancement in psychology have. The strategy of incarceration in American prisons is a dated system and is incapable of helping the prisoners or benefiting the taxpayers. So this intro is much more logos heavy, starting with the very beginning of prison system with the Romans in 1700s BC, up to when America first started in the 1700s AD, and then briefly hinting at advancements in psychology, which would eventually prove within her paper that the system also needs to advance. And that's going to be her argument. The strategy of incarceration in American prisons is a dated system and is incapable of helping the prisoners or benefiting the taxpayers. So when you're talking about introductions, we're talking about hook, background information, thesis statement. And then you may want to consider, depending on your topic, do you want to appeal to emotion, like our first author did, giving a very specific and personal story of a wrongly accused man, or the second, which focuses much more on logos, background information, historical context.